Hi friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. This is Story Time. It is Saturday, so we are doing Story Saturday today, reading one of the stories that I wrote, so you can enjoy it and then come back for more. But first, we're going to have a word from our sponsor being me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, you should go buy that book. Anyway, so this being Saturday, we are continuing on reading stories that I did last year as part of my writing project. And we are reading today a time travel story called Eyes of Gold. This came out of the time travel romance workshop that I participated in last week, trying to learn how to do time travel with romantic elements. And watching Big Ben, the episode from a couple weeks ago, was the first story that I wrote for that. This is the second one. I think it turned out better than Big Ben did. Not that Big Ben was bad, but you know what I mean. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. I wrote it. I'm reading it. It's awesome. Let's get to it. Jeff knew what to expect. He'd studied for years getting ready for his journey. He studied the culture until he could recite the various customs and traditions as readily as his own, learned classical Greek to the point he could have a comfortable conversation in it, and hadn't that taken some doing. He'd become accustomed with riding with a quill and how to ride a horse. He even learned how to swing a gladius without stabbing himself in the foot. But when he stepped through the time portal and emerged in a copse of trees on a hilltop a mile away from Athens, he found himself rooted to the spot, his mind totally blank as he forgot everything he had learned and planned. The heat of the early summer sun poured down upon him through a break in the canopy, and though the Greek-style garment he wore was loose and off-white, he immediately began to sweat despite the gentle breeze wafting across the land from the east. The breeze smelled clean, more clean than anything he'd encountered before around Oxford, where he had done most of his studying and preparation. But there was also a hint of wood smoke there, as well as spiciness that he couldn't quite place. The sky was a brilliant blue, painted only occasionally by a puffy cloud floating gently by, and the sun was almost at high noon. He took a moment to look around. Nobody there, thank God. There shouldn't have been. There was no archaeological evidence of habitation in this particular spot, but really, what did that mean? He had contingency plans if someone happened to be here when he arrived, a small air gun with tranquilizer darts, which he had strapped to his chest beneath a fold in his tunic, that should put a person out long enough to accomplish his goal. But he really didn't want to have to use it, and he was just as happy that he hadn't had to. From the pouch tied to his sash, he pulled out a small, collapsible compass and checked it. He knew the terrain from his studies, but who knew what really would be different 2,000 years ago? Satisfied that he knew north, he pushed his way through a thick bramble of undergrowth and descended the hill toward the road leading to the eastern gate of the city. His sandaled feet felt every rock beneath their thin leather soles on his way down, and he found himself wincing after just a few hundred feet. He should have walked in them more. But that discomfort eased when he stepped onto the Roman road. Smooth and solid now, not the pitted and worn, though still impressive, construction that he had seen and felt in his time, it immediately made for a more comfortable walk. A moment later, he rounded a bend and found himself halting from awe again, as the city proper came into view. He had been to modern Athens. The ruins of the past were there up on the hills above the city and elsewhere. But it was a modern city, nothing like the expanse of classical architecture in front of him now. Columns and arches lined the streets, all whitewashed to brilliant beauty. The Parthenon was intact, easily visible, as was the Acropolis, and hundreds of lesser buildings that combined into a flowing thing of beauty that to his eye put every city of his time to shame. And Rome was more grand still. He had to get there someday too, but for now he needed to focus. He looked up at the sun again, estimating the hour. If his calculations were correct, Paul would be making his appearance in the Areopagus in about 2 hours. He knew roughly where it was, but he had been careful to give himself time to reach it and get situated to observe. He had read the recording of Paul's discourse in the Acts of the Apostles, of course, but that could not have been a word-for-word record. He wanted to hear it all. Record it all. He needed to hurry, or he'd miss it. Ahead, the gates of the city stood open, and a red-cloaked troop of legionnaires were marching out toward him on the road. The man leading the troop had the plumed helmet of a centurion, and the standard-bearer at his side carried a tall staff from which hung the red banner with the SPQR of Rome embroidered in golden thread. Jeff shoveled to the right to let the column of soldiers pass well to his left, and had to work hard to not shrivel from the stern-eyed stare of the centurion as the battle-hardened man, tanned and muscled, with a puckered scar that cut through the blackness of his left eyebrow, took his measure as he led his command past. The scent of sweat accompanied the creaking of leather and the thumping of their feet as they marched in perfect unison with their commander. They were just as hard as he was, if more youthful, and several of them looked over him as he passed, then looked away with dismissive sniffs. Jeff turned to watch them go and didn't find their casual dismissal at all insulting. He had met hard men before in his own time. Even the weakest in those legionnaires would give the toughest he had met a run for his money, he was sure. He gave himself a shake, then he hurried on to the gate. His heart was beating 100 beats per minute at least, but not from fear of the past soldiers, from exhilaration. This was even better than he'd hoped it would be. He found he was smiling ear to ear as he passed within the city. Sophia pushed the sleeves of her dress up to keep them from getting wet, then picked up the clay pitcher she had brought with her from her father's house and bent over the stone-walled pool in front of her to fill it. The pool was a good 30 feet across, filled with runoff from an aqueduct coming down from the mountains to the north of the city. The water was clear for the most part, owing to the fact that the pool drained into ducts beneath the city streets, so that it could continue flowing despite pooling here briefly on its way. Or at least that's what her older brother, an engineer in service of the city, told her. She was willing to take his word for it. Her interest lay in other areas than planning and construction, and anyway, it seemed to work pretty well. The water spilled off the last of the aqueduct's run, a third of the way around the pool from where she was standing, making a continuous splashing sound that carried over the hubbub of conversation from the dozens of other people milling around the square where the pool was located. Despite the hustle and bustle all around, she almost could close her eyes and imagine she was in a country near a little waterfall, if she focused on that splashing sound enough. Almost. Not today, though. It only took a minute to fill her pitcher, but she left it submerged for a time, enjoying the coolness of the water as it flowed past her forearms. In the heat of the day, she was often tempted to just jump into the pool sometimes. She felt that now in a flash of impulsiveness. She would not, of course. Not since the one time she'd done it as a child and the thrashing that had earned her. Mother had taught her quite plainly, bathhouses and drinking pools are not the same thing. It still pulled at her, though, if only for the mischief of it. With a sigh, Sophia straightened and pulled the pitcher from the water. She set it on the rim of the pool for a moment to rearrange herself before hefting it back to her father's house. As she pulled her sleeves back down, she glanced around the square again, and her eyes alighted on a man who had stopped a half a dozen paces from her. He was taller than average, clean-shaven, with a long, lean face that was topped by a curly mess of reddish-brown hair that stood out against the sea of mostly black and brown worn by her countrymen. His clothing was exceptionally well made, the finest of fabric, and dyed a shade just off of white, fringed with a blue thread. The pouch at his belt bulged. Clearly, he was a man of means. But he had a look of bafflement on his face. He was scratching at his chin with his left hand as he looked first left and then right. Sophia didn't normally bother strangers, especially strange men, but there was something about this fellow, the way he stood out so uniquely in the crowd, or she didn't know what it was. Still, she surprised herself when she called out, "Are you lost, stranger?" The aqueduct square was magnificent. The fluted columns bringing the final flow into the pool itself were precisely aligned to create a gentle slope so the fluid would not create an excessive splash when it spilled into the pool, but it was subtle enough that you almost wouldn't notice it if you only looked at one section. The pool itself was intricately carved, with images of animals of all sorts scampering around the outer stonework and engravings of fish in the stonework at the pool's bottom. The square was paved in polished flagstone, though it could be marble. Jeff wasn't good at telling one stone from another, giving the entire space a formal, elegant appearance that turned the everyday task of obtaining water into an exercise in artistry. Any other time, Jeff would be content to stand and study the work for hours, but he had already taken longer than he expected to find his destination, and he had to admit he was completely turned around. So when the voice grabbed his attention, offering assistance, he turned to face it gladly, and stopped dead. He hadn't even recognized the voice was female until he saw her. She was shorter than the norm he was used to, but that was to be expected. She had black hair that was woven into a single braid that draped over her left shoulder. Her dress, dyed a light blue, was as modestly conservative as one would expect in this time period, but the modest tailoring could not conceal the fact that she had a wondrous figure, curved in all the right places and apparently well-toned. But what really drew him in were her eyes. Dark, as you would expect from a Greek, but with flecks of gold almost sprinkled in the deep brown of her irises. The rest of her face was merely pretty. The eyes made her stunning. Like the fountain, he could almost just stare at them for hours and not find the time lacking. But that would not do at all, so instead he cleared his throat and put on a friendly smile. "I am embarrassed to say that I am, miss. Can you point me toward the Areopagus?" She blinked, and her eyes flicked up and down his frame for a second. He felt himself being weighed and measured, and found it rather appealing for a moment. "You don't look like a philosopher, and your accent is strange. Where are you from, stranger?" Jeff found himself flushing. "Pardon my manners. My name is Geoffrey. My family is from Britannia, but I've traveled most of the Empire in my studies." She nodded slowly, digesting that and apparently deciding it met with her approval. "Sophia," she said, then pointed behind him and to his left. "Go that way 2 blocks, then turn right and continue a quarter mile, then left and you can't miss it." She cocked her head for a second as though considering, then added, "I don't believe they're meeting today, though." Jeff blinked, thrown for a loop. "I hope you are mistaken. I had very much hoped to hear a man speak there today." "Who?" She was awfully inquisitive and knowledgeable about the goings-on of philosophers. Not that the latter should be a surprise. Athens was a city full of gods and philosophers, after all, but women didn't typically get involved in that during this time, so Jeff found himself even more intrigued. "A man named Paul." She frowned, then visibly perked up. "Paul? The man from Tarsus in Cilicia? You know of him?" Sophia shrugged. "Only through my younger brother. He's a Platonist and likes telling me about their latest debates. But Geoffrey," she raised her eyebrows, "he told me the man Paul spoke there 2 days ago." "You're kidding." She shook her head. "Damn." The crestfallen look on Geoffrey's face made Sophia's heart go out to him. It was the look of a fellow who had put all his hopes on a thing, only to see it waft away into the ether. She knew that feeling. Perhaps that was why she just didn't let it lie and let the man go about his business, dashed though it was. Instead, she found herself saying, "My brother tells me he was proclaiming some strange new god, but that his words were intriguing." Sophia smiled as she recalled the expression on her brother's face when he related the tale. "Very intriguing. Justus hasn't stopped talking about it, or him, for 2 days." Geoffrey nodded emphatically. "I would be shocked if he wasn't enthralled." "You know of Paul's teachings?" "Only through writing. I've never met the man or seen him speak." Geoffrey's eyes went distant, and he turned to look in the direction of the Areopagus, frowning. "I am very sorry to have missed it." "Well, I am certain Justus would enjoy talking about it with you if you have a care to." Geoffrey blinked, then looked at her, his expression guarded. "I would not seek to impose." Sophia found herself laughing at that, not at the man's polite consideration, but at how unneeded it was, where her brother and a talk about philosophy was concerned. "Believe me, if Justus were to find out that you had more understanding he could delve into, and I didn't invite you to speak with him, I would never hear the end of it." Geoffrey nodded slowly, thinking it over. Then he made a little frown that screamed regretful refusal. "I've come all this way," he said. "I simply can't not see the Areopagus, at least." That was odd. Not like he couldn't visit it tomorrow, or the day after, or any other time when they'd met to debate next. Was he just going to go through the weeks of travel from wherever he came from just to turn around and leave so quickly? Strange idea, and more strange was the pang that sent through her for a moment. After all, why should she care if this fellow she met just moments ago would stay or go? But looking at him, the earnestness on his face, she found she didn't like the idea of not seeing him again. If you change your mind, he is helping me care for our father in his last days. His house is up the street, just 3 blocks. She pointed the direction. Ask for the house of Apollonios. Geoffrey smiled at her and lit his face up. Thank you, Sophia. I may just do that. All the way to the Areopagus, Jeff kicked himself mentally. Clearly his calculations had been badly wrong. 2 full days off. But how? He had been meticulous, double-checked every record, every reference, every variable. To have come all this way and missed the very target he came for, it was infuriating. The analytical part of his mind pushed back on that train of thought. After all, being accurate to within 2 days over the span of 2,000 years was quite good. Admirable work, all things considered. Except that it meant his mission, his entire purpose for coming here, was a failure. So, he told the analytical part of his mind to shut up, and he stewed. He stewed so hard that he barely noticed the intricacies of the Areopagus's design and construction. Artistry matched with practicality to precisely match the purpose for which it had been created. As he walked away from the admittedly magnificent structure, he felt in a daze from the disappointment still. The chronometer he'd synchronized with the time portal's telemetry limiter was tucked away next to his air pistol. He took a moment near the side of one of the streets to fish it out and have a look. 4.5 hours until the limiter's window closed, and he would be unable to open a portal back to his own time. He could open the portal at any time up until then, but only at the target location where he had arrived. Now that he knew the way back, he was sure he could get back there in an hour, maybe a bit less. Might as well just go, chalk this up as a loss, and go. Jeff turned to do just that, but then the image of dark brown eyes with flecks of gold flashed into his mind, and he paused mid-step. Where did Sophia say her father's house was? It was silly to remain for a lovely set of eyes, but it wasn't just her eyes that intrigued him, was it? She had a boldness, a zest about her that struck at something in Jeff's psyche. And really, if he had the time, it would be a crime not to see as much of this wondrous city and this wondrous time as he could. A crime against scholarship and science. It was as good an excuse as any, so instead of heading back to the gate in his portal, he turned his steps back to the aqueduct square, and then to the street she had indicated. When the bell announcing guests rang, and Sophia opened her father's door to find Geoffrey standing in the entryway, she was shocked by the surge of pleasure that ran through her at seeing him. Not that he was ugly, far from it, but he was not the sort of dashing pile of handsomeness that she had always found most appealing in men. All the same, there was something about him. Good afternoon, Sophia, he said politely. I hope I'm not intruding. Of course not, she said, and led him inside, then through an anteroom to a writing chamber where Justus was seated in front of his work table, quill in hand as he worked on his latest treatise. She couldn't remember the topic, something obscure, though she would never say that to him. Justus looked up as they entered, and for a second Sophia was struck by how much his round face, framed by black curls, resembled their fading father's. Much less lined, of course, and he had not even begun to go gray, and wouldn't for several years yet. But in the dimmer light of this interior room, Justus had not lit any candles. Instead, relying on the natural sunlight from outside, she almost forgot that their father was lying abed 2 rooms over and not sitting here where he had so often sat in the past. An upsurge of sadness, a preview of the grief of loss that she knew was soon to come, swept through her for a second. She forced it down. Looking at Geoffrey and gesturing toward him for Justus's sake helped, strangely enough. Justus, this is the man I told you about, Geoffrey, from Britannia. Justus was up out of his seat before she had even finished speaking, his light green robes billowing in the breeze that his sudden movement created about himself. His eyes were delighted, his smile broad and welcoming as he greeted Geoffrey. I'm so glad you've come. Sophia tells me you're a disciple of Paul? Geoffrey blinked, then shook his head. No, not of his, though I know of his teachings, and I follow his God. If anything, Justice's smile grew larger. "Excellent! Come, my friend, you must tell me more about this man and his God." He took Geoffrey by the arm and began to lead him away, but he paused after a step and looked back at Sophia. "Sophia, will you bring some wine to the rear courtyard, please?" She couldn't help but smile fondly at Justice and chuckle at his exuberance. She nodded. "Of course. Enjoy yourself." For a second, as he was being led away almost bodily, Geoffrey looked back at her, a harried expression on his face, and she laughed more loudly. She almost felt guilty putting the poor man through this. Almost. Sophia busied herself with preparation for the evening meal and tending to their father's infrequent requests. She lost track of the time, but the shadows had grown noticeably longer when the two men stepped back into view from the rear courtyard. "Are you sure you will not stay for a meal?" Justice was saying as the two of them approached her. Geoffrey shook his head. "I cannot, I'm afraid. I have another commitment this evening." He paused, then looked from Justice to her. "But I would very much enjoy seeing you again." It seemed his eyes lingered on her for longer than on her brother, and Sophia felt a little stirring of pleasure in her belly at that. "And I as well," Justice said. The two men clasped hands, and then Geoffrey turned to leave. He paused, though, giving Sophia a direct look. "Thank you for your assistance today, Sophia. Until we meet again." "Soon, I hope," she found herself saying, and he flashed a smile at her. Then he stepped through the portal to the street, and he was gone. "Well," Justice said, stepping up over next to her. "A very interesting man, don't you think?" She nodded. "Yes." Justice looked sidelong at her and grinned that mischievous smile that he had mastered when he was 6 and she was only 4. She just rolled her eyes in response, but inwardly she knew his teasing was pretty close to the mark. Jeff reached the hilltop and the cluster of trees where the portal would open, without incident and with 20 minutes still to go on the limiter timer. He stood there with the portal trigger in hand, willing himself to activate it and get back to where he belonged. But he hesitated. This had been a day beyond what he had expected. Glorious, exuberant, exciting, disappointing, surprising in almost every way. A large part of him didn't want to leave. It was foolish, he knew, but he could not deny it. The future he was going back to felt sterile, lifeless compared with the living artistry he had been walking through all day. Yet, he had missed Paul's speech. That was disappointing, but it didn't change the overall truth of his visit. It had been amazing. And he could go back 2 days and... He stopped mid-thought. Could he just go back those 2 days? If he did, there was a significant chance he would bump into Justice at the Areopagus, and maybe Sophia somewhere in the city on the way to or from. That would certainly cause a paradox of some kind, because when they met him for the first time today, after having already met him 2 days earlier, he knew there was lots of debates among physicists, even now with time portals a reality, about how reality could deal with such a thing. Some said it would be physically impossible to make such a trip, that the laws of the universe would step in to preclude it from happening, somehow. Others said it would branch off a new parallel universe following the changed path the second trip made. Others said more outlandish things, getting all the more outlandish the more people weighed in. Regardless, the protocols were hard and fast now. Any potential paradox was to be avoided on pain of severe punishment. So if anyone knew he was going back earlier and they knew about his meetings now, they would stop him from doing it, unless he lied, or just took a rogue trip. But those carried their own problems. But the more he thought of it, the issue of paradox wasn't why he found himself rejecting the idea of coming back to see Paul's speech on the actual day. What did it was the image of dark brown eyes with flecks of gold in the irises. Even the possibility of messing up the timelines they would not have met, or could not meet again? No, he wouldn't do that. Couldn't. But he would definitely be coming back, that was for certain. And he would set the timer for a longer window, so he wouldn't have to rush. After all, he had the writings of Paul's speech, and his other speeches and letters. He knew what Paul had to say. He didn't really know Sophia yet, but he found he really wanted to. Finally, he pressed the recall button, and the world exploded in a kaleidoscope of light that had brought him back to his own time. But soon to come back again, and see where things went. Okay, so that's the story. Obviously a fun one. like little bits of little meet cute action going on there. It's always fun to travel back in time to ancient Athens and not see Paul the Apostle because you met a pretty girl instead. Well, I mean, what are you going to do? So yeah, this one was kind of fun to write. I made a bit of a hit at the workshop that I went to, at least with the guy who was running the workshop, thought it was great, but of course he said what you already know is that, hey man, Jeff's got to go back and, we got to make this a full romance. They try to make it work with the girl. And of course I haven't gotten to that yet. Probably end up being in a short novel. It's on my list of things to do, but as always, that list is long and growing longer. Right now we're focusing on the planned work for this year, which was the Libreville 7 book that we started a month or so ago, and getting that finished up, and then of course the Space Navy book, which will be later on this summer. And after that, I have 2 more that I need to get squared away to finish up some stuff that I have. I've had multiple things that I've been working on over the years that you start and you stop and you start and you stop and you start and you stop, and so I'm finally kind of clearing up the back, not back list, but the back burner stuff that you hadn't been working on, even though you started and like it but got distracted. That's sort of what we're doing the next this year and into the first part of the next one, and then we'll go back and do things like finish up that fun romance story, maybe. In the meantime, it's a fun little short story, and I hope you liked it. Next week, we're coming back for the final story in Volume 1 of last year's project. It's a story called Dream of the Dryad. It is a fantasy/horror kind of thing, and it's pretty cool. I liked it. You will too. Between now and then, you know what you need to do, though. You need to go and buy some books. Best place to get books of mine is michaelkingswood.com/stores. The best store, the store that my company owns, the place where you can go to get the books you want, the format you want, with no middleman. Why no middleman? That means I get more money. And it means you have a direct one-to-one relationship with the writer that you like, and you feel good about supporting to the maximum extent, and yay, everybody's happy. If you like middlemen, or have your own system set up with them, and that you're on the Kindle or whatever, you can of course find me at all the various retailers out there. But please note, you can get my stuff even if you're on the Kindle and stuff. Comes with a little thing that'll let you install it. But anyway, if you go straight to me. But if you don't want to do that, you can go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read. That's a universal aggregator thing where you can click on the title. It'll show you all the stores where it's available, and you can get the story you want. Other things, of course, you must do is, if you haven't subscribed here already, whether on the podcast or the video or whatever, make sure you've done that. Make sure you've liked and clicked and everything that makes it look awesome. Tell all your buddies about the fun that we're having here, reading stories. And if you don't want to buy a book, but you want to show some monetary support for the effort that we put on here, we've got our little subscribe star page going on. Emphasis on little. subscribestar.com/Michael-Kingswood. And you can set up a little thing, couple bucks to help keep the lights on around here. That wouldn't hurt either. All right, I think that's all I need to say right now. Yeah, I think we're good. Make sure you go buy books. Come back next week. We're going to read another story, that Dream of the Dryad story. You will like it, and I'll like doing it. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.